Hey everyone, it's Nick from Sonic Tone Amps. Today we're going to take on the classic debate of tube amps versus solid state amps. But instead of another flame war, we're going to have a constructive discussion about the pros and cons of each, and have a little history lesson along the way. So stay tuned. Full disclosure, I build and sell tube amps, so I may be a little biased, but not as much as you might think. Let's start with the current state of the guitar amp market today. We'll start with tube amps. Of course, what I consider the holy trinity, you have Fender, Vox, and Marshall, and they're still creating and producing the classic circuits that made them famous from decades ago. But that's just it. They really haven't done much of those circuits in those years. And you can get those tones, but they're going to be lacking in features. They're not going to have effects loops, channel switching. You're still going to have to jumper with 4-hole inputs and all of that. It's kind of a hassle. But if that's a tone you want, you can still get those. Of course, that led the way for other amp companies to come along and add new features and improve these designs to make them more user-friendly and offer more to the players. That'd be like Randall Smith at Mesa Boogie, Mike Soldano, Dave Freeman, and many, many others. So that's kind of the snapshot of where tube amps are. And of course, along the way, they've gone from tones that were classic, clean, vintage tones all the way to today's modern high-gain tube tones. And there's a big, big competitive market with high-gain tube amps. Moving on to solid-state amps, which have been around for a few decades now, there are companies that offer a solid-state product lineup like Fender, Orange, and Peavey, and many others, and they're priced competitively to offer an alternative to a tube amp. But these solid-state amps are light on features as well. They have similar features to their tube amp counterparts, but it's still very basic, channel switching, some onboard EQ, and things like that. Taking it up to the next level is all the new digital modeling that's now available. And this takes the solid-state amp predecessors and adds digital processing and circuitry to it that allows it to more closely emulate tube-like sounds. And in the amp package format, you have the Boss Katana, you have the Vox Valtronics, and the Marshall Code. And instead of just being basic solid-state amps with an input and some gain and volume knobs and an EQ, you now have additional controls that let you dial in modeled and emulated tube sounds, which sound pretty authentic. Going even further on that is the professional level stuff that's done by Kemper and the Fractal Axe effects, as well as the floorboard versions and the Helix. So those really up the game in modeling, particularly the Kemper, where you can sample your own tube amps using a microphone into the Kemper unit and save and store all of your tones in one unit and then go out on the road with it. I actually owned one of these and it was extremely impressive technology. However, in my opinion, it gets you very, very close, but there's still something lacking in the responsiveness and touch while you're playing your guitar through these. But that's just my opinion. So that's kind of a roundup of the current state of guitar amps between tube amps, solid-state amps, and the relatively new digital modeling offerings. Next, we're going to take a quick little trip down memory lane and do a little history lesson on where it all started. So let's get into a brief historical look at tubes and their solid-state counterparts, transistors. Now, nerd alert, this might get a little technical and a little nerdy, so if you want to skip ahead to the next section, I won't take offense. What makes tubes tick is thermionic emission, which is the process of liberating electrons from one electrode to another. And this process was discovered in 1853, then rediscovered in 1873, and then finally Thomas Edison independently discovered it in 1880. With his penchant for publicity, was able to get it the attention it needed so that real work could be started on it in the US and in Europe. The very first tube, a diode, was invented in 1904. That's how old this technology is. The next tube up was a triode, which was invented a couple years later in 1907. Of course, the main application that was instantly identified to use vacuum tubes was audio amplification. Communication devices like radios got an instant boost and improvement using vacuum tubes. And of course, soon after that, the need to amplify these new electric guitars was needed, so the guitar tube amp market was born. However, the downsides of this new technology became quickly apparent. These were fragile devices encased in glass, and they consumed a lot of power. As early as 1925, Julius Lilienfeld applied for a patent for the very first field effect transistor. However, his work was mostly theoretical because the high quality resources to build such a device wouldn't exist for a couple of decades. It wasn't until the post-war late 1940s that the real work on solid-state transistors began, both here in the US at AT&T Bell Labs and also in Europe at our Westinghouse subsidiary in Paris. Independently, they both invented the point contact transistor, which led to the bipolar junction transistor being invented in 1948. But in 1953, they had real-world applications, and the first prototype of a transistor radio was produced. This led to a huge marketing push to transition away from tube-powered devices to devices that use solid-state transistors. And if any of you are old enough to remember, you might have had grandparents that had devices like radios or something like that in the kitchen or the living room, and they might have said transistor or solid-state on them because this was a huge marketing point, a huge selling point, because you didn't have to buy tubes anymore. You didn't have to replace tubes. And therefore, a lot of commercial devices that use tubes, they went by the wayside and were replaced by similar devices that use transistors. And therefore, the tubes only really persisted and persevered in two main markets, which were guitar amplifiers and high-powered audio amplification. The next topic I'd like to talk about are the pros and cons of tube amps and solid-state amps. One of the first marks against the tube amp is its cost. Due to the nature of the components that go into building a tube amp, such as the large transformers, the cost of a tube amp is generally higher than a solid-state amp. The next thing that goes against the tube amp is its weight. Those large transformers and other components add to the weight of the tube amp, and they're generally heavier than solid-state amps. However, one of the main things in favor of a tube amp, and why here in 2022 we still build, sell, and buy tube amplifiers, is that tube tone. And even though the solid-state amps and modelers have come a long way over the past few years, people still want that authentic tube tone. So what does that mean? Well, when a guitar signal goes through an amplifier, it's not just a linear signal coming through and getting louder. There are artifacts that are introduced into the signal, and they can make the signal sound better, or they can make it sound worse. In the case of a tube amp, it emphasizes even ordered harmonics, which add to the sound and make it sound fuller and more warm, which is that tube tone we like. In the case of solid-state devices, it emphasizes odd ordered harmonics, and that makes it sound more harsh, especially when driven into distortion, and it's not as pleasing. So that's why solid-state amps tend to emulate tubes the best they can with what they have in their arsenal, but they can't always quite get there and replace fully a tube tone. At least that's my opinion. Another thing that sort of goes against solid-state devices that people don't think about is that solid-state devices are more susceptible to thermal and electrical events. What that means is that if there's a huge spike in voltage or a big flash of heat, that solid-state device is most likely going to get fried and have to be replaced. The tube, on the other hand, while we described it as a fragile device earlier because it is encased in glass, is more likely to survive that kind of event. It can handle those voltage spikes and heat and live to fight another day. Another area that people like to compare tube amps and solid-state amps is maintenance and reliability over time. The tube amp has another mark against it because you have to replace the tubes every once in a while. Some people are a little more fanatical about it. Depending on how much they play, they might replace the tubes every 6 months to a year. Some people might not replace them for 4 or 5 years. But that is a cost you have to consider when buying a tube amp. You don't have to worry about that with a solid-state amp. When it comes to maintenance and reliability in general, I think it's kind of a wash because if an amp is built well, whether it's a tube amp or a solid-state amp, it should last a really long time. But I actually would give a couple of points to a tube amp, especially if it's a hand-wired amp on a turd board with proper solder joints and robust components. That should last a very long time. In comparison, a solid-state amp will be on a PCB, a printed circuit board, and that could degrade over time, become conductive, and you might have issues with that circuit board after a decade or two. Next up, we're going to take a high-level tour of the inside of a tube amp and point out the different components and what they do. Okay, the last thing we're going to do in this video is take a high-level overview of the inside of a tube amp. I happen to have next to me here the Sonic Tone Royal Crown 30, or RC30, which is a fantastic sounding tube amp. In fact, this is one of the first amplifiers I sold when I opened up shop. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at the different components. Okay, here we have the inside of the Sonic Tone RC30 taken out of its cabinet. We're going to focus on a couple of different sections and the components that make up those sections, starting with the power supply or power section over here. Leading off that section, of course, is the power transformer. It takes the AC voltage out of the wall and steps it up to the high level of AC voltage that we need for this amplifier. However, amplifiers run off of DC voltage, so that AC voltage has to be converted or rectified into DC voltage, and that's done with the tube rectifier over here. Also contributing to the power supply are the large filter caps right here and the choke over here, this little guy in the middle, which helps smooth out that power and make it a little more stable for the amps to use down the line. The tube rectifier itself, while it doesn't process audio directly, lends itself to a certain sonic characteristic to the amp down the line by how it makes the voltage readily available to the tubes to use. An alternative is solid-state rectification using little diodes like this, which are inexpensive and very efficient. These have a firmer sound to them, and a lot of amps that have tube rectifiers may have a switch that allow you to switch to the solid-state rectifier, giving you that firmer response. Or you can work off the tube rectifier, which gives you a little more compressed, spongier sound that some players like. We're going to come over to the preamp section over here. This particular model has 4 preamp tubes. 2 of them are dedicated to the input signal and amplifying that signal. One's dedicated to the tube effects loop that's in this model. And the last preamp tube is the phase inverter, which splits the signal up and gets it ready for the power tubes. The power tubes in this amp are 4 EL84s, which have a very sweet tone, and they drive the output transformer, which is over here. It cannot be overstated how important the output transformer is to a tube amplifier. It is as much of the sound of a tube amplifier as the tubes themselves, and is very much the heart and soul of the amp. The tube output transformer really lends itself to the character of the amp and gives the amp its color at the final stage. What ends up happening is, particularly when a tube amp is driven very hard, there's a level of harmonics and color that come out of this device, this being such a large magnetic device, that solid-state amps don't have. And this is something people don't talk about a lot when they're comparing solid-state amps to tube amplifiers. This is definitely a mark in favor of tube amps, is what you get out of a tube amp's output transformer. Okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Make sure you click the subscribe button down below and check out Sonic Tone Amps for more information on the Sonic Tone product line. We'll see you soon.